The sound of Kalen's boots against broken asphalt echoed through the hollow remains of what had once been downtown Phoenix. 3 years had passed since the outbreak consumed America, turning bustling cities into graveyards and neighbors into nightmares. The desert sun blazed overhead, casting long shadows between abandoned vehicles and skeletal buildings that stood like tombstones against the azure sky. In this new world, silence was both a blessing and a curse. It meant safety from the infected, but it also meant death had already claimed everything else. Kalen adjusted the worn leather strap of her rifle, scanning the desolate street ahead. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking ammunition counts and escape routes with the muscle memory of someone who had learned that hesitation meant becoming another casualty in humanity's losing war. Behind her, 4 other survivors moved in formation, their eyes constantly darting between windows, doorways, and the maze of overturned cars that provided both cover and potential ambush points. Thorne, a former mechanic whose massive frame still carried the strength of his previous life, brought up the rear with a modified sledgehammer that had saved their group more times than anyone cared to count. His salt and pepper beard was streaked with dust, and his eyes held the haunted quality that marked all survivors, the look of someone who had seen too much and lost even more. Beside him walked Ember, barely 19 but aged beyond her years by the apocalypse. Her red hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and despite her youth, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had learned to kill or die. The other 2 members of their makeshift family were Zephyr, a former nurse whose medical knowledge had kept them alive through countless injuries and illnesses, and Soren, a quiet man who had once been a park ranger and now served as their tracker and scout. Each carried their own collection of weapons and supplies, everything they owned strapped to their backs or holstered at their sides. They were a unit forged by necessity, bound together by the shared understanding that alone, they would certainly perish. Their destination was the Phoenix Veterans Hospital, a massive concrete structure that rose from the city's heart like a fortress. Intel suggested that military remnants had established a safe zone there, complete with food, medical supplies, and most importantly, other living humans. For weeks, they had been following radio transmissions that promised sanctuary, hope, and the possibility of rebuilding something resembling civilization from the ashes of the old world. As they moved through the urban wasteland, the evidence of humanity's collapse surrounded them like a museum of the apocalypse. Children's toys lay scattered in yards where grass had long since withered and died. Family photos fluttered from broken windows, their faces smiling up at a sky that no longer held promise. Shopping carts filled with belongings told stories of desperate evacuations that had ultimately failed, their owners now part of the endless hordes that roamed the countryside in search of living flesh. The infected had different names depending on who was talking: zombies, walkers, the turned, the lost. Kalen preferred to think of them simply as the dead, because that's what they were, people who had once loved, laughed, and dreamed, now reduced to base hunger and primal violence. The virus, whatever it was, had swept across the nation with unprecedented speed, bringing down governments, militaries, and every institution that had once seemed permanent and unshakable. A distant moan carried on the desert wind, causing the group to freeze instantly. Soren held up a closed fist, the universal signal for stop, and they all dropped into defensive positions behind the rusted remains of a city bus. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of feet dragging across concrete. Through the bus's broken windows, they could see movement, a small group of infected wandering aimlessly through what had once been a busy intersection. These were the remnants of the morning commute that would never end, people who had been caught in traffic when the outbreak reached Phoenix. Their business suits were torn and stained with 3 years of weather and decay, their faces pale and expressionless except for the constant hunger that drove them forward. They moved without purpose or intelligence, guided only by the instinct to feed on any living thing they encountered. Kalen felt her heart rate increase as she counted at least 8 infected in the immediate area, with possibly more hidden among the vehicles. The hospital was still 6 blocks away, and they had limited ammunition for a prolonged firefight. Every bullet was precious in this new world, and attracting attention with gunfire could bring dozens more infected running toward them. She looked at her companions, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. They had come too far to turn back now. The group waited in tense silence behind the bus for nearly 20 minutes, watching the infected shamble past their hiding spot with the patience that only desperation could teach. Ember's knuckles were white where she gripped her machete, and Kaelin could see the young woman's jaw clenched with the effort of remaining motionless. Every survivor had their breaking point, and Kaelin worried that Ember was approaching hers after losing her younger brother just 2 weeks prior during a supply run gone wrong. When the infected finally moved beyond their immediate vicinity, Soren gestured toward an alternate route that would take them through a residential neighborhood rather than the more direct path down the main street. The detour would add another hour to their journey, but it offered better cover and fewer sight lines for potential threats. In this world, patience wasn't just a virtue, it was the difference between reaching tomorrow and becoming another victim of humanity's greatest failure. They moved like ghosts through backyards and alleyways, stepping carefully over broken glass and debris that could alert their presence to any infected lurking nearby. Thorn's heavy boots made barely a whisper against the ground despite his size, a skill he had developed through trial and error during the early days when noise could mean death within minutes. The neighborhood they traversed told its own story of the outbreak's progression. Some houses showed signs of hasty evacuation, while others bore evidence of violent struggles that had ended badly for the occupants. Zephyr paused at the remains of a small family home, her medical training automatically cataloging the dried bloodstains on the front porch and the claw marks around the doorframe. She had seen enough crime scenes in her former life to read the signs of what had happened here, and her expression grew darker as she followed the trail of destruction that led from the house into the street. The infected didn't just kill, they consumed, and what they couldn't finish immediately often rose again to continue the cycle. As they approached the hospital district, the signs of military intervention became more apparent. Concrete barriers had been erected across major streets, now crumbling and overgrown with desert vegetation. Abandoned tanks and armored vehicles sat like metal monuments to humanity's failed last stand, their hulks providing cover for the group as they advanced. The government's response had been swift but ultimately inadequate against an enemy that didn't fear bullets and couldn't be negotiated with. Kaelin remembered the early days of the outbreak when news broadcasts still functioned and officials assured the public that the situation was under control. She had been stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado then, watching her fellow soldiers struggle to comprehend an enemy that violated every principle of warfare they had been trained to understand. Traditional military tactics proved useless against adversaries who felt no pain, showed no fear, and couldn't be demoralized or forced to retreat. The Phoenix Veterans Hospital loomed larger as they drew closer, its 10-story structure dominating the skyline with its institutional architecture and countless dark windows. What had once been the main parking lot was now a maze of abandoned vehicles and makeshift barriers, creating a no-man's land that offered both concealment and countless hiding spots for potential threats. Soren held up his hand again, this time pointing toward movement near the hospital's main entrance. Through her binoculars, Kaelin could see human figures moving with purpose rather than the aimless wandering of the infected. They wore military gear and carried weapons in organized formations, exactly what the radio transmissions had promised. Her heart surged with hope for the first time in weeks. They had found other survivors, people who might have news of safe zones, supply lines, or even government remnants still fighting the good fight. But something felt wrong about the scene below. The soldiers moved too rigidly, their formations too perfect for people who had been fighting a guerrilla war against overwhelming odds for 3 years. Real survivors developed a more fluid, adaptive style born from constant improvisation and the need to respond quickly to changing threats. These people moved like they were on parade, not like they were living in a world where a single mistake could mean becoming lunch for a pack of infected. Ember noticed it too, her young eyes sharp with the paranoia that had kept her alive when so many others had fallen. She tugged on Kaelin's sleeve and whispered her concerns about the soldiers' behavior, noting how they seemed to be guarding the entrance rather than simply maintaining security. Their positions and movements suggested they were keeping people out rather than welcoming survivors in, which contradicted everything the radio broadcasts had promised about open sanctuary. Zephyr crouched beside them, her medical training providing another perspective on the scene below. Through the binoculars, she could see that the soldiers showed no signs of the malnutrition, exhaustion, or stress injuries that marked all long-term survivors. Their equipment was too clean, their movements too energetic for people who had been fighting for their lives for years. Either they had access to resources far beyond what any other survivor group possessed, or something else entirely was happening at the hospital. The radio crackled softly with another transmission, the familiar voice promising food, safety, and medical care for any survivors who could reach the facility. But now that they were close enough to observe the reality of the situation, the broadcast felt more like bait than salvation. Kaylin felt a chill run down her spine as she realized they might have walked into a trap, drawn by the promise of sanctuary into something far more dangerous than the infected they had been fleeing. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Kaylin of the fires that had consumed so many cities during the early days of the outbreak. They had been observing the hospital for 2 hours now, and the patterns of movement below only reinforced their growing unease about the supposed safe zone. The soldiers maintained their rigid positions with mechanical precision, never breaking formation for casual conversation or showing any of the human behaviors that characterized real survivor communities. Soren had used his tracking skills to circle around the hospital's perimeter, returning with disturbing news about what he had discovered. The building's rear entrance was heavily fortified with razor wire and automated gun turrets that tracked movement with electronic precision, technology that required significant power and resources to maintain. More troubling were the covered trucks that arrived every few hours, their contents hidden beneath thick canvas tarps that prevented any observation of what was being transported into the facility. Thorne's mechanical expertise provided another piece of the puzzle as he studied the hospital's infrastructure through binoculars. The building showed signs of recent renovation and expansion, with new additions that looked more like laboratory facilities than medical treatment areas. Power lines had been upgraded to handle much higher electrical loads than a simple hospital would require, and ventilation systems had been modified with industrial-grade filters that suggested containment protocols rather than standard air conditioning. The radio transmissions continued at regular intervals, always the same message delivered in the same calm voice that promised safety and salvation to any survivors within range. But now they noticed subtle details that had escaped their attention during the desperate weeks of travel. The background noise was too clean, lacking the ambient sounds that would characterize a real survivor settlement. There were no children's voices, no sounds of daily life, no indication that actual people were living and working within the facility. As darkness began to fall, their worst fears were confirmed when they witnessed something that chilled them to the bone. A small group of survivors approached the hospital's main entrance, emerging from the urban wasteland with the same hope that had drawn Kaylin's group to this place. They looked exhausted and desperate, carrying makeshift weapons and wearing the patched clothing that marked all long-term survivors of the apocalypse. The soldiers received the newcomers with professional courtesy, guiding them through the main entrance with promises of food and medical care that echoed the radio broadcasts. But instead of the warm welcome that survivors typically gave to other humans they encountered, the process felt clinical and impersonal. The survivors disappeared into the building's depths, and despite watching for hours afterward, none of them emerged or appeared at any of the windows. Ember's youth had made her particularly sensitive to deception, and she pointed out details that the others had missed during their observation. The soldiers never removed their helmets or showed their faces, communicating through hand signals rather than spoken words. Their movements were too coordinated, too synchronized for individuals who had developed their skills through the chaotic experience of fighting infected. They moved like machines rather than men. Zephyr's medical background provided the most chilling interpretation of what they were witnessing. The hospital's modifications, the power requirements, the containment protocols, and the systematic collection of survivors all pointed toward a single, horrifying conclusion: this wasn't a safe zone at all, but rather some kind of research facility that was using desperate survivors as test subjects for experiments related to the outbreak. The implications were staggering and filled them all with a mixture of rage and despair. While they had been struggling to survive in the wasteland, believing themselves abandoned by their government and military. Those same institutions had apparently been continuing their work in secret. The radio broadcasts weren't humanitarian efforts but rather bait designed to lure survivors into a trap that would make them subjects in whatever research was being conducted within the facility's walls. As full darkness settled over the city, they watched the hospital's windows glow with artificial light that spoke of abundant power and resources. Inside those walls, people were living with electricity, climate control, and all the comforts that the outside world had lost 3 years ago. But the price of admission appeared to be freedom itself, and possibly life as they knew it. Kaylin felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her shoulders as she considered their options. They could attempt to infiltrate the facility and rescue any survivors being held there, but the technological advantages and military training of their opponents made success unlikely. They could try to expose the truth by broadcasting warnings on the radio frequencies, but they lacked the equipment and power to override the hospital's transmissions. Most practically, they could simply turn around and find another destination, leaving whatever was happening here as someone else's problem. But none of those options sat well with her conscience or her sense of duty to the other survivors who were still out there, following the same false hope that had nearly led her group into captivity. The radio broadcasts were probably reaching hundreds or thousands of desperate people across the southwestern United States, all of them believing they were heading toward salvation when they were actually walking into a nightmare. The group huddled together in the darkness, sharing their observations and fears while trying to formulate a plan that offered some hope of success without guaranteeing their deaths. They were 5 people with limited ammunition and supplies facing an unknown number of well-equipped opponents who had the advantage of fortification, technology, and preparation. By any rational calculation, they should retreat and focus on their own survival rather than attempting to be heroes in a world that had already proven heroes couldn't save it. The night brought a cold desert wind that carried the scent of decay and dust through the abandoned city, reminding them that even in this moment of human betrayal, the infected remained the primary threat to anyone moving through the darkness. Kaylin made the decision to establish a temporary camp in a partially collapsed office building that offered concealment while maintaining sight lines to the hospital. They would spend the night gathering more intelligence before making any irreversible decisions about their next course of action. Soren volunteered for the first watch, his ranger training making him ideally suited for nighttime surveillance in hostile territory. The others tried to rest, but sleep came fitfully as their minds wrestled with the implications of what they had discovered. Ember lay with her eyes closed but her hand never leaving the grip of her machete, while Thorn periodically checked and rechecked his weapons with the methodical attention of someone preparing for battle. During the dark hours before dawn, they witnessed additional arrivals at the hospital, more survivors drawn by the false promises of sanctuary. Each group that approached the facility disappeared through the main entrance, never to be seen again at any of the windows or exterior areas. The pattern was consistent and systematic, suggesting that whatever was happening inside had been operating for an extended period with practiced efficiency. Zephyr used her medical knowledge to speculate about what kind of research might require live human subjects in a post-apocalyptic setting. The most likely scenarios involved attempts to develop immunity to the infection, create more effective treatments for bite victims, or even efforts to weaponize the virus for use against remaining population centers. All of these possibilities required extensive human testing that would be impossible to conduct under normal ethical constraints. As dawn approached, they made a discovery that changed everything about their understanding of the situation. Soren noticed movement in the hospital's lower levels, windows that glowed with a different quality of light than the upper floors. Through careful observation with binoculars, they could see that these basement areas contained holding cells filled with survivors who had been captured by the false sanctuary operation. The sight of imprisoned survivors sparked something primal in each member of the group, reminding them of everything they had lost and everyone they had failed to save during the 3 years since the outbreak began. These weren't just strangers facing an unknown fate, they were fellow humans who had endured the same struggles, losses, and desperate hope that had driven Kaylin's group across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. Ember was the first to voice what they were all thinking. They couldn't simply walk away knowing that innocent people were being held captive and used as test subjects. Her youth made her less calculating about odds and consequences, but her passion reminded the others of why they had continued fighting when surrender would have been easier. The world had taken so much from all of them that they couldn't bear to let it claim more victims without at least attempting to intervene. Thorne's mechanical expertise became crucial as they began planning a rescue operation that would require precise timing and coordination. The hospital's security systems were sophisticated, but they were designed to keep people out rather than prevent escapes from within. If they could somehow gain access to the building's interior, they might be able to create enough chaos to allow some of the prisoners to escape during the confusion. The key would be creating multiple simultaneous diversions that would overwhelm the security force's ability to respond effectively. Soren could use his tracking skills to approach the building undetected and disable power systems, while Thorne could create explosive devices from materials scavenged from abandoned vehicles. Kalen would lead the main assault through whatever breach they could create, while Ember and Zephyr focused on locating and freeing the imprisoned survivors. They spent hours refining their plan, accounting for every detail they could anticipate while acknowledging that much would depend on improvisation and luck once the operation began. The odds were heavily against them, but the alternative, leaving their fellow humans to whatever fate awaited them in the research facility, was unacceptable to people who had already lost so much that they had little left to lose except their own humanity. As they prepared for what might be their final mission, each member of the group reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had started as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but they had become something more valuable than family. They had become people who would risk everything to protect others, even when those others were complete strangers who might never know their names. The radio continued its false promises throughout the morning, drawing more survivors toward the trap that masqueraded as salvation. Each transmission strengthened their resolve to act, knowing that every hour of delay meant more innocent people would fall victim to the deception. They were about to attempt something that violated every survival instinct they had developed, but sometimes the most important battles were the ones that logic said you couldn't win. Kalen checked her weapons one final time and looked at the faces of her companions, seeing determination mixed with fear and expressions that had grown precious to her over the months they had spent together. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would face it together as they had faced everything else since the world ended. In a reality where humanity seemed to be dying one person at a time, their willingness to risk themselves for strangers represented something worth preserving. The attack began at precisely noon when the desert sun would create the most disorienting shadows and heat distortion around the hospital complex. Soren had used the morning hours to position himself near the building's power infrastructure, while Thorne had crafted improvised explosive devices from materials scavenged from a nearby automotive repair shop. The plan required split-second timing and the kind of coordination that could only come from absolute trust in each other's abilities. Kalen felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Soren disappear into the maze of utility buildings that housed the hospital's electrical systems. The Ranger moved like a ghost through the industrial landscape, using every shadow and blind spot to avoid detection by the security cameras that monitored the facility's perimeter. His signal, a brief reflection from a small mirror, would indicate when the power disruption was about to begin. The waiting was the hardest part, knowing that once they committed to this course of action there would be no retreat or second chances. Ember crouched beside Kalen with her weapons ready, her young face set in an expression of fierce determination that reminded the older woman of herself at that age. Zephyr carried a medical kit along with her weapons, preparing to treat wounded survivors during what would inevitably be a chaotic evacuation attempt. When Soren's signal flashed across the distance, everything happened at once with the violent precision of a thunderstorm. The hospital's lights went dark as the main power grid failed, followed immediately by the rumbling explosion of Thorne's diversionary charges detonating near the main entrance. Emergency generators kicked in within seconds, but the brief darkness had already disrupted the security cameras and automated defense systems. Kalen led Ember and Zephyr in a sprint toward the rear entrance while the facility's defenders rushed to respond to the apparent attack on the front of the building. They had perhaps minutes before the confusion would resolve into organized resistance, and everything depended on reaching the basement levels where the survivors were being held before the security forces could mount an effective defense. The rear door had been locked and reinforced, but Thorne's mechanical expertise had anticipated this obstacle. A small shaped charge placed precisely at the hinges brought the barrier down with minimal noise, creating an entry point that led directly into the hospital's service corridors. They moved through sterile hallways that smelled of disinfectant and something else, something organic and wrong that made Zephyr's medical training recoil with instinctive horror. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red illumination as they descended toward the basement levels, following the building's layout that Soren had memorized during his reconnaissance. The sounds of combat echoed from above as Thorn engaged the security forces with hit-and-run tactics designed to keep them focused away from the real rescue operation. His sacrifice bought them precious time, but they all knew he was facing overwhelming odds with no realistic chance of survival. The basement corridor stretched ahead of them like something from a nightmare, lined with reinforced doors that each contained a small observation window. Through the glass, they could see the faces of survivors who had been captured by the false sanctuary operation, people who looked up with desperate hope when they realized that rescue might actually be possible. Some had been imprisoned for weeks or months, their clothes hanging loose on frames that spoke of inadequate nutrition and poor treatment. Zephyr's medical expertise proved crucial as they began opening cells and evaluating which prisoners were healthy enough to travel immediately. Many showed signs of medical experimentation, injection sites, surgical scars, and in some cases modifications that suggested they had been subjected to procedures related to infection research. The sight filled them all with rage that momentarily overcame their fear and exhaustion. As they worked to free the prisoners, they discovered the true scope of the operation they had stumbled upon. Documents scattered throughout the basement revealed that this facility was one of several research sites operated by remnants of the CDC and military establishment, all focused on developing biological weapons based on the infection that had destroyed civilization. The survivors weren't just test subjects, they were raw material for creating enhanced versions of the virus that could be deployed against remaining population centers. The rescued survivors moved like zombies themselves, traumatized by their experiences and weakened by months of captivity and experimentation. Some could barely walk, while others showed signs of psychological damage that might never fully heal. Ember took charge of organizing the evacuation, her youth and energy helping to motivate people who had given up hope of ever seeing freedom again. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor above indicated that their time was running out as security forces began sweeping the building systematically. Kalen made the painful decision to leave behind several prisoners who were too weak or injured to travel, knowing that attempting to evacuate everyone would likely result in the capture or death of the entire group. The mathematics of survival required brutal choices that would haunt her forever. As they led the rescued survivors toward their planned escape route, explosions and gunfire from the upper levels indicated that Thorn was still fighting his delaying action against overwhelming odds. His courage was buying them the minutes they needed to reach safety, but they all knew the price he was paying for their success. The big mechanic had accepted a suicide mission with the same quiet dignity he brought to every other challenge they had faced together. 23 survivors made it out of the building through the rear entrance, stumbling into the desert sunlight with the dazed expressions of people who had never expected to breathe free air again. Some collapsed immediately, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion, while others looked around with the paranoid vigilance of prey animals who knew predators were still hunting them. They were free, but they were also homeless refugees in a world that had already proven it offered no true sanctuary. The group moved away from the hospital complex with the urgency of people who knew that pursuit was inevitable once the security forces finished dealing with Thorn's diversionary attack. The rescued survivors struggled to keep pace, their months of captivity having weakened them both physically and psychologically, but the terror of recapture drove them forward through the desert wasteland that surrounded the facility. Kalen felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her shoulders as she tried to organize 23 traumatized people into something resembling a functional unit. Many of the rescued survivors were in shock, moving mechanically without fully comprehending their freedom, while others showed signs of the psychological damage that came from extended periods of medical experimentation and imprisonment. Zephyr worked tirelessly to provide medical care as they traveled, treating infected wounds, malnutrition, and the various injuries that marked the prisoners' time in captivity. Her supplies were limited, but her expertise allowed her to prioritize care for those who needed immediate attention to survive the journey ahead. Some of the rescued survivors showed signs of having been infected with experimental versions of the virus, though whatever treatments they had received seemed to have prevented full transformation. The sound of helicopters in the distance confirmed their fears about pursuit, and Soren used his tracking skills to guide them toward terrain that would make aerial reconnaissance more difficult. They moved through arroyos and rocky outcroppings that provided cover from above while avoiding the main roads where ground vehicles could easily overtake them. Every step took them farther from the false sanctuary that had nearly claimed them all. Ember proved invaluable in working with the younger rescued survivors, using her own experiences of trauma and loss to help others begin processing what they had endured. Several of the prisoners were barely out of their teens, and their resilience gave the entire group hope that humanity might still have a future worth fighting for. Her ability to connect with people who had given up on trust helped to bind the growing group together. As they traveled through the day, stories emerged from the rescued survivors about what had been happening inside the research facility. The experiments went far beyond simple virus research, extending into attempts to create enhanced humans who could survive in the post-apocalyptic environment while remaining immune to infection. The failures had been disposed of quietly, while the successes were kept for further study and eventual deployment as super soldiers. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving multiple government agencies and military units that had continued operating in secret while the rest of the nation collapsed into chaos. Resources that could have been used to establish genuine safe zones and rebuild civilization had instead been diverted into research programs designed to create biological weapons for use against the remaining human population. The revelation that their own government had been systematically harvesting survivors for medical experiments while broadcasting false promises of sanctuary filled the group with a rage that burned hotter than the desert sun. They had endured 3 years of struggle, loss, and desperate hope while believing they had been abandoned, when in reality they had been deliberately ignored so that secret programs could continue their work without interference. As evening approached, they reached an abandoned mining complex that offered defensible positions and concealment from aerial surveillance. The facility had been excavated into the mountainside, providing natural protection and multiple escape routes if they were discovered by pursuit forces. Soren's expertise allowed him to quickly identify the safest areas for establishing a temporary camp. The rescued survivors began to share their individual stories around carefully concealed fires, creating a tapestry of horror that revealed the true extent of what they had escaped. Families had been separated for research purposes, children had been subjected to experimental procedures, and anyone who showed resistance had been subjected to increasingly brutal treatments designed to break their will. One survivor, a woman named Celeste who had been a teacher before the outbreak, described experiments involving controlled exposure to infected tissue while various drugs and treatments were tested for their effectiveness. Another, a man called Darius who had been a construction worker, bore scars from surgical procedures that had attempted to graft infected tissue onto healthy subjects to study immune responses. The medical documents that Zephyr had salvaged from the facility provided additional details about the research program's objectives and methodology. Project Lazarus, as it was called, aimed to create enhanced humans who could serve as both soldiers and colonists in areas where normal humans couldn't survive. The ultimate goal was to establish new population centers in regions heavily contaminated with the infection. But the most disturbing revelation came from a survivor named Orion who had worked as a communications specialist before his capture. He had discovered that the false sanctuary broadcasts were being transmitted from multiple locations across the country, suggesting that the Phoenix facility was just one node in a much larger network of research sites. Thousands of survivors might be suffering the same fate they had just escaped. The weight of this knowledge created a moral burden that none of them had anticipated when they first decided to rescue the imprisoned survivors. They now possessed information that could potentially save thousands of lives, but they lacked the resources or capability to broadcast warnings that would reach the intended victims. They were 26 people with limited supplies facing an enemy with virtually unlimited resources and government backing. As they settled into defensive positions for the night, each member of the group wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Were they obligated to attempt some kind of resistance against the conspiracy they had discovered, or should they focus on finding a safe place where they could start rebuilding their own lives? Could a small group of survivors make any meaningful difference against an enemy that commanded helicopters, advanced technology, and multiple research facilities? The night brought unwelcome visitors in the form of a military convoy that had somehow tracked their movements despite Soren's careful attention to concealment and misdirection. The sound of engines echoing through the canyon announced their approach long before the vehicles became visible, giving the group precious minutes to prepare defensive positions among the mining equipment and rocky outcroppings that surrounded their temporary camp. Kalen organized the survivors into 3 groups based on their physical condition and combat capability, with the strongest fighters taking forward positions while the wounded and traumatized were moved deeper into the mine shafts where they would have protection and multiple escape routes. The abandoned mining complex offered excellent defensive terrain, but they were still vastly outnumbered and outgunned by whatever force was approaching. Through the darkness, they could see the lights of at least 6 military vehicles accompanied by what appeared to be armored personnel carriers designed for operations in hostile territory. The convoy moved with professional precision, establishing blocking positions that would prevent escape while maintaining formation discipline that spoke of experienced soldiers rather than hastily assembled security forces. Soren used his knowledge of the mining complex to position himself in an elevated sniper position where he could observe the approaching force and potentially disrupt their coordination with accurate rifle fire. His ranger training had included advanced marksmanship, and their situation was desperate enough to justify using lethal force against what were technically American military personnel. The standoff began when a voice echoed across the canyon through electronic amplification, offering the group one final opportunity to surrender peacefully in exchange for guaranteed medical care and resettlement in a legitimate safe zone. The speaker claimed that the Phoenix facility had been conducting authorized research vital to national security, and that interference with their operations constituted an act of terrorism during a national emergency. Ember's response was to fire a single shot that sparked off the rocks near the speaker's position, clearly communicating the group's answer to the surrender demand. The sound echoed through the canyon like a declaration of war, and within seconds the night erupted in violence as both sides opened fire with everything they had available. The military force had superior weapons and equipment, but the survivors held advantageous terrain and the desperate motivation of people who knew that capture meant death or worse. Zephyr coordinated the defense from a protected position deeper in the mines, using her medical training to treat wounded fighters and keep them in the battle despite their injuries. The fighting continued through the night with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage over the other. The soldiers gradually advanced through the mining complex, clearing positions with professional efficiency, but each step forward cost them casualties and ammunition. The survivors gave ground slowly, fighting for every tunnel and chamber while extracting maximum cost from their pursuers. As dawn approached, it became clear that the military force was preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm the survivors' remaining defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. They had taken significant casualties during the night, but they still possessed overwhelming advantages in weapons, armor, and tactical coordination that would inevitably prove decisive. Kalen made the painful decision to initiate evacuation procedures for the wounded and non-combatants while the remaining fighters attempted to buy time through continued resistance. The mining complex had multiple escape routes that led deeper into the mountain, offering the possibility that some survivors might reach safety even if the defensive positions were overrun. The final assault began with a concentrated bombardment of the survivors' forward positions using rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons that reduced their carefully prepared defenses to rubble within minutes. The soldiers advanced behind this barrage with tactical precision, clearing each position methodically while maintaining formation integrity despite continuing resistance. Soren's sniper position became untenable as the soldiers identified his location and concentrated fire on his position until the rocky outcropping became too dangerous to occupy. He was forced to abandon his rifle and retreat deeper into the mines, joining the general evacuation that was already underway. His accurate shooting had disrupted several assault attempts, but the enemy's numerical superiority was finally proving decisive. The evacuation moved through tunnels that Soren had scouted during their brief occupation of the mining complex, leading toward exits that would place them several miles away from the main battle. The wounded survivors struggled with the difficult terrain, but terror provided motivation that overcame physical limitations as they fled deeper into the mountain's protection. Behind them, the sounds of battle gradually diminished as the military force secured the mining complex and began searching for survivors who might have escaped through the tunnel system. Their professional training included pursuit tactics, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the escape routes and resumed their hunt for the people who had exposed their secret research program. 13 survivors made it out of the mining complex through the mountain escape routes, leaving behind everything except their weapons and the clothes on their backs. They had lost nearly half their number in the fighting, including several of the rescued prisoners who had died defending people they had known for less than 24 hours. The cost of resistance was proving higher than any of them had anticipated. As they emerged from the mountain tunnels into the pre-dawn darkness, they could see helicopters circling the mining complex with searchlights that swept across the terrain in systematic patterns. The hunt was continuing with resources that suggested this operation had high priority within whatever remained of the government and military establishment. 3 months had passed since the battle at the mining complex, and the 13 survivors had become something more than a refugee group. They had evolved into a resistance cell dedicated to exposing the truth about the government's secret research programs. Their journey had taken them across 4 states, always moving, always hunted, but gradually building a network of contacts among other survivor communities who shared their determination to fight back. Kaylin stood on a ridge overlooking the Nevada desert, watching the sunrise paint the wasteland in shades of gold and amber that reminded her of better times before the world had ended. The group had found temporary sanctuary in an abandoned military bunker where they could rest, resupply, and plan their next move against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources and no moral constraints. The rescued survivors had proven to be invaluable assets in their resistance activities, bringing detailed knowledge of the research programs that had held them captive. Celeste, the former teacher, had become their intelligence specialist, analyzing documents and communications intercepts to identify new facilities and warn potential victims. Her analytical mind had helped them understand the scope of what they were fighting against. Darius, the construction worker who bore scars from the medical experiments, had become their demolitions expert, using his knowledge of building construction to identify the most effective ways to disrupt the research facilities they targeted. His practical skills complemented his burning desire for revenge against the people who had treated him like laboratory equipment rather than a human being. Orion's communications expertise had proved crucial in establishing contact with other survivor groups and broadcasting warnings about the false sanctuary operations. They had managed to save dozens of people by providing advance warning about the trap locations, though they knew many others were still falling victim to the deception despite their efforts. The cost of their resistance activities had been higher than anyone wanted to calculate, measured not just in lives lost but in the constant stress of being hunted by forces that commanded advanced technology and government resources. They lived like ghosts, never staying in one place long enough to feel safe, always looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit. Ember had grown up during their months of resistance work, her youthful optimism tempered by the harsh realities of guerrilla warfare against overwhelming odds. She had become their scout and infiltration specialist, using her small size and quick thinking to gather intelligence from locations that would be too dangerous for the others to approach. Her courage continued to inspire everyone around her. Zephyr's medical skills had expanded to include battlefield surgery and trauma treatment as their activities inevitably resulted in wounded fighters who couldn't seek help from conventional medical facilities. She had saved countless lives through her expertise, but the psychological toll of constantly treating injuries caused by human cruelty was wearing her down despite her professional training. Soren had become their strategic planner, using his knowledge of terrain and tactics to design operations that maximized their impact while minimizing casualties. His ranger background proved invaluable in planning escape routes and establishing safe houses, though he privately wondered how long they could continue their activities before the enemy's superior resources proved decisive. Their most recent operation had been their most ambitious yet, a coordinated attack on 3 research facilities simultaneously, designed to rescue prisoners while gathering intelligence about the program's ultimate objectives. The mission had succeeded beyond their expectations, liberating over 60 survivors and capturing documents that revealed the true scope of Project Lazarus. The intelligence they had gathered painted a terrifying picture of the government's post-apocalyptic agenda. The research programs were preparing for a new phase of civilization where enhanced humans would serve as the ruling class while normal survivors would be relegated to slave labor or eliminated entirely. The false sanctuary operations were just the beginning of a systematic campaign to control or eliminate everyone who had survived the original outbreak. But their success had also brought increased attention from the enemy, who now considered their small group to be a significant threat to national security. The latest intelligence indicated that special operations teams had been deployed specifically to hunt them down, with orders to capture them alive for interrogation about their methods and contacts. As the sun climbed higher into the desert sky, Kalen reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had started as 5 strangers united only by the need to survive, but they had become something more valuable. They had become living proof that humanity could still choose to fight for what was right even when the odds were hopeless. The radio crackled with another false sanctuary broadcast, the same calm voice offering hope to desperate survivors who didn't know they were being lured into captivity. But now there were other voices on the airwaves too, survivors who had been warned by their activities, spreading the truth about the government's operations and organizing resistance in communities across the remaining United States. They couldn't know how many people they had saved or how much difference their resistance had made in the larger struggle for humanity's future. But as Kalen looked at the faces of her companions, scarred, tired, but still determined to keep fighting, she knew they had chosen the only path they could live with. The world had ended 3 years ago, but the human spirit had proven harder to kill than civilization itself. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, carrying the truth like a torch through the darkness that had consumed America. In a reality where hope had become the rarest commodity, their willingness to keep fighting represented something that no virus or conspiracy could ever truly destroy. Behind them, the bunker held 13 souls who had refused to surrender their humanity even when surrender would have been easier. Ahead lay another day of running, hiding, and fighting against impossible odds. But they were still alive, still free, and still human in a world that seemed determined to destroy all 3. That would have to be enough.